And first up on the tech news for June 27th, the week of June 27th, is Apple's big, big deal. Apple is switching their Macintoshes from Intel processors to ARM processors. Now, the ARM processor is the single most popular CPU design in the world. It's in everybody's smartphones. It's a scaled down version is in the Apple Watch. It's in tablets. It's in everything. The only thing it's not in is PCs. That's Intel and AMD. Apple is moving away from Intel CPUs to have ARM in its entire lineup. Now, they're calling it Apple Silicon, but these chips are ARM chips, and this is a big deal. Apple wants to own the software stack from top to bottom. They don't want to buy CPUs from Intel anymore because Intel is a big profit item. So they're giving not only the cost of the CPU to Intel, but also the profit to Intel. So Apple can have more of the pie for themselves, and they can design it to be tightly bundled with the operating system. And ultimately, this is going to lead to a ton more performance. They're talking 100 to 1,000 times performance as these processors have grown over time. So this is a big deal. Couple things will not happen with this anymore. You're not going to be able to use Boot Camp and dual boot your Macintosh to run Windows. What Apple has said is you will be able to run other operating systems in a virtual environment. So you can run Linux on your ARM Macintosh, but you're not going to run it natively. You're not going to dual boot. You're not going to throw a partition on the hard drive and boot from that for Linux. You'll run it in a virtual machine. There are articles all over the web talking about this transition. I've just got one up here from the Tech Report that kind of gives you a quick summary of what's going on here. The big question is, how are you going to run pre-ARM Apple Macintosh programs on your new ARM Apple Silicon Mac? Well, their plan is to use Rosetta. They're going to have a translator. It's going to take the Intel binaries and compile them to run on the ARM processor. It'll be a one-time compile. It will not be interpretive, so Rosetta 2 should be a lot faster than Rosetta was when Apple went from the PowerPC chip to the Intel chip many years ago. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this all plays out. My take off the top of my head is this is not a good thing for Intel, because a lot of the Apple Macs have high-end chips. They have i7s or even better, and that's the fat of the profit in the CPU market for Intel. So in the long run, this is going to accelerate the shrinking of the x86 CPU market, since the market for Windows laptops and Windows desktops is shrinking. So in the long run, I feel that this is going to be bad for Intel and also for AMD. Now, how fast are these Apple Silicon Macs going to be? Well, benchmarks are already starting to leak out from the developer boxes. And we should know in a few months just how much faster these machines will be. Uh, I'm not gonna chase down the rabbit hole trying to look at these benchmarks, but even a couple years ago, there were benchmarks comparing the performance of the Apple A12 CPU to an Intel i5 processor, and the Apple A12 was benchmarking better. So you're not you're not talking about, oh, that's a phone CPU. It's not powerful compared to my desktop CPU or my laptop or my gaming laptop. These processors have real power, and it's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how this all turns out over the next 6 months. Okay, I decided I do want to talk a little bit about the power of the ARM CPUs in the Apple devices versus the Intels. So, for instance, if we look at the two latest iPhones, the 11 and the iPhone SE second generation, and if I just keep scrolling down here and we look through everything, the processor on both of these is the A13 Bionic chip. Isn't that exciting? And if I look at this article I found here to compare the Intel Core i5, now this is 2 generations back, but each generation of Intel processors has not jumped in power an awful lot. But if I scroll down here and we look at them, they have a similar base frequency, a similar turbo frequency. You can see the Apple has energy saving cores and high performance cores versus the cores that are in the i5 are all the same. The amount of memory that comes with these machines is different. They both use DDR4 memory. Look at the power differential. This is a low-end i5 and it's using 15 watts. This is Apple's most powerful processor and it only uses 6 watts. I'm willing to bet the integrated graphics is far superior on the Apple. And let's look at some of these benchmarks. Single core performance, the Apple A13 is winning by a large margin. Multi-core performance, it's winning by what, 10%? Gigaflops performance, the i5's a little bit faster. The points of performance per watt, look at the difference there. The Apple it can do 3 times the work for the same wattage. So you're really looking at a powerful processor. And as they go to the desktop, as they're looking at making a custom chip for their Apple Macintoshes, you can bet that they're going to have more than 2 high performance cores. So, like I said, it's going to be interesting. Next up is this article I found on AnandTech talking about Intel's next generation of CPUs, where they're going to go to what's been done on the ARM processors that you see on Android and Apple for years, which is you have some high performance CPU cores that use a lot of power but can get the work done, and then you have some low power cores that can stay in the background, see if you got a text message coming in, see if you got a phone call coming in, keep all those things alive that need to be done on your phone when you've got it in your pocket and the screen turned off. That uses a low power core. And that's one of the reasons that ARM processors can be sitting there using half a watt of power when you're not really using it, when you don't have it cranked up. So Intel's been working towards this, and to me it's very puzzling that they're kind of coming to this now. They're like 10 years late to the party, and Intel's low power processor, the Atoms, have just been a total flop. There's been no uptake in them in consumer products because their energy budgets are still way too high. So we'll see where this goes, but you can see their plan is basically to have one big core and 4 little atom cores. And they're saying that basically in sleep mode that there'll be about 90% less power being used. So 7 watts is certainly much closer to what you're seeing with ARM, but it's just going to be most likely too little too late for Intel to extend its market share into other areas like Android phones, obviously not going to Apple phones. So if they'd had this 8 or 10 years ago, yeah, maybe. If this was something they were working towards when Apple first came to Intel, saying, when Steve Jobs came to Intel and said, hey, we want to do this smartphone, we want you to make a CPU for us, and Intel said, we're not interested. That's one of the largest mistakes in the history of tech. It's almost as big of a mistake as digital research not writing the operating system for the first PC. This little nothing company called Microsoft ended up writing that operating system, and who's heard of digital research? Feel free to say in the comments. And who's heard of Microsoft? So this is just probably too little too late. So next up on the news this week, and that it's big tech news when you have an article on a non-tech website. I first saw this on Reuters.com. Massive spying on Google Chrome because of 32 million downloads of dodgy Google Chrome extensions. What could go wrong when you go to download an extension that says it's going to do something wonderful for you for nothing? So of course, this has been the plague of extensions and plugins on all web browsers for years. Dodgy and malicious plugins. So I'll just say to you, don't do plugins. Don't do extensions. Even if you download a good one that's totally legit, what happens is the bad players offer the person that wrote that plugin money they couldn't refuse. They take over the plugin and then they update it to be dodgy. So it's just a bad situation. You can get more details over at Ars Technica, and you can get an idea of what some of these plugins are. Like, here we go, PDF Opener, My Docs to PDF, Easy Convert. What could go wrong with all these dodgy ones? Or security plugins that are doing the opposite of security. ByteFence security browsing. These are, no, just stay away from plugins. It's like whack-a-mole for Google. They cannot control these malicious plugins because they're not going to have a programmer look at the source code of every one of these plugins to make sure it's not malicious. So just don't do extensions and plugins. Period. End of story. That's my advice to you. The last article I want to talk about is on ZDNet, and it talks about Apple declining to implement some web APIs, application programming interfaces, in Safari due to privacy concerns. And this reminds me of in the early days of the internet when Microsoft was adding all kinds of extensions into Internet Explorer like ActiveX and some other stuff that was functionality over security. And we used to get all kinds of horrible problems. It was the equivalent of early day plugins and extensions. And, you know, what could go wrong if they add an API so that your web browser can figure out your battery status or scan your Bluetooth devices to see if they have flaws in how they implemented their Bluetooth security, or serial API so it can talk through your USB devices, which are serial devices. So kudos to Apple to saying, no, we're not going to do this, because these kinds of extensions that promise functionality over security are just ticking time bombs waiting to happen. And once something becomes a standard, how do you ever get rid of it? And how do you fix it in a way that doesn't break everybody who's using it the way it was originally written? It's just a mess. So my hat's off to Apple to say no to this stuff. They say it would allow advertisers to fingerprint your machine based on the hardware it can probe that's hooked up to your machine. Then they know it's you and not somebody else. And then that's how you get, okay, I looked at a vacuum cleaner on Amazon.com and I go to Facebook and I get vacuum cleaner commercials and advertisements. Or you looked at an electric car once and for the next 6 months you get electric car ads. It's almost comical. So Apple is doing this to fight fingerprinting, but I think there would certainly also be security exploits to this type of thing as well. So this was tech news number 1. I'm going to wrap it up. Plan to do this about every 2 weeks. So if it goes really well, hey, this will become a Friday thing. It just depends how much tech news is out there, according to me, what I think is interesting. Please consider, well, don't consider, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.